Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to jump into a debate that's been going on for centuries, all centered on one of Christianity's most fundamental rituals, baptism. So, you've probably seen baptisms, but maybe you've noticed they aren't all the same. Some churches sprinkle, some pour, some go for the full dunk. This opens up our central case. Is there one single biblically correct way to baptize? We're going to follow the evidence and just see where it leads. So here's how it generally shakes out. You've kind of got two main camps. On one side, churches that baptize infants often use sprinkling or pouring. And on the other side, you have churches that focus on a believer's baptism, and they're typically pretty set on full immersion, dipping the person completely underwater. All right, so where do we even begin with this? Well, let's start by playing detective and looking at the first pieces of evidence we can find from the early church itself. You know, when you start digging into the historical record, some really interesting stuff pops up. Archaeologists have found these ancient baptismal fonts from the 4th and 5th centuries that are just, well, they're pretty tiny, way too small to dunk an adult in. We also have ancient art, like frescoes from the 3rd century, that clearly show water being poured over someone's head. And even earlier than that, we have writings from the 2nd century that straight up mention pouring and sprinkling. But, and this is a huge but, here's the catch. All of this evidence, the fonts, the art, the writings, it all comes after the New Testament was written. So while it tells us what Christians were doing later on, it doesn't give us a slam dunk answer about what the original practice was. There's a pretty significant evidence gap. So with that evidence gap staring us in the face, we've got to go straight to the source material. It's time to put on our linguistic detective hats because this whole thing might just hinge on cracking the code of one single, super important Greek word, baptizo. Before baptizo became the word for Christian baptism, it was just a regular old Greek word used in everyday life. And if you look it up in a dictionary, you'll see it could mean a few different things: to dip, to sink, or even to dye or tinge something in a liquid. And this flexibility, well, this is where our investigation gets really tricky. All right, let's open our first case file. This comes from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the story of Naaman, he's told to go wash in the Jordan River, and the text says he went down and dipped himself. And guess what Greek word they use there? Yep, baptizo. Now, in this case, the original Hebrew word that's being translated actually means to plunge. So, yeah, the evidence here points pretty strongly toward immersion. Case 1 looks like a lock for team immersion. But just when you think you've got it figured out, another case file from the same source throws a wrench in the works. In this story, the hero Judith bathed at a spring. The Greek word for bathed is, you guessed it, baptizo. So what was she actually doing? I mean, did she somehow fully dunk herself in a little spring? Or was she just, washing up by pouring water over herself? The text just doesn't say. So the verdict here? Totally ambiguous. Okay, next up, we're jumping into the New Testament itself. In Luke's gospel, a Pharisee is having Jesus over for dinner and is just shocked that Jesus didn't baptizo before the meal. I mean, come on, it would be pretty ridiculous to think this Pharisee expected Jesus to take a full-on bath before sitting down for dinner, right? This is almost certainly talking about the common Jewish ritual of washing your hands, probably by having water poured over them. So in this case, baptizo clearly means washing, not full immersion. So if the word itself can mean a few different things, why are so many people so convinced that immersion is the only way? Well, that brings us to the prime suspect in our investigation, a famous passage from the Apostle Paul. Pretty much the entire argument for immersion hangs on this incredibly powerful imagery you find in this one verse from Romans, chapter 6. Paul connects baptism directly to Jesus' death, his burial, and his resurrection. And you can see why, right? The logic is super compelling. Going down under the water, that's a perfect picture of being buried with Christ. And then, when you come back up, boom, you're raised with him to a new life. It's this beautiful physical metaphor that just makes sense. So at this point, it really seems like an open and shut case for immersion, doesn't it? But what if we've been looking at the wrong clue this whole time? What if there's a plot twist? Think about it. The whole argument we just looked at is focused completely on the motion, right? The physical action of going down and coming up. But remember that other definition we talked about, that baptizo could also mean to die?
Now really think about what happens when you dye a piece of cloth. The point isn't really the dipping motion, is it? No, the point is the result. The cloth is fundamentally, permanently changed. It takes on a completely new quality. It becomes one with the dye.
So with this completely new way of looking at the evidence, what's our final verdict in this investigation? Okay, let's run through the case file one last time. The early historical evidence, it's too late to be certain. The key Greek word baptizo, it's ambiguous. And the meaning of that word, well, you can look at it in two totally different ways. It can be all about the motion, which leads you to immersion, or it can be all about the result, which leads you to this idea of union.
So here's the bottom line. Because all the evidence, both historical and linguistic, isn't a slam dunk for any one side, the source material for this explainer lands on this conclusion. The specific physical way you do it, whether it's sprinkling, pouring, or immersing, that's not actually the most important part of the whole thing.
And this quote right here just nails it. If the real focus is on the result, that dyeing analogy, then baptism isn't just about acting out a burial. It's about being totally changed, about being identified with and becoming part of a new reality, the community of believers. And that meaning, that works no matter how much water you use.
And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If the how of baptism isn't set in stone, what does that tell us about the why? Maybe it's supposed to push us to focus a little less on the external details and a whole lot more on the profound spiritual reality that it represents.